The security cameras captured everything, frame by frame, second by second. What should have been an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in a mansion worth $30 million became the scene of an event that would shake an entire family to its core. In the central courtyard, surrounded by marble columns and perfectly manicured gardens, a 4-year-old boy played innocently with his toy cars. 20 meters away, lying in the sun like a golden sculpture of muscle and fangs, rested a 190-kilogram lion, the same creature that 2 years earlier had arrived at that house as an exotic cub, a whim, a symbol of power and unlimited wealth. Nobody imagined that in less than 5 minutes, the silence of that mansion would be shattered by a scream that still echoes in the nightmares of everyone who was there that day. This is not a story about animals. It's a story about what we believe we can control, about how money can buy almost anything except wisdom, about how a decision made in a moment of arrogance can unleash consequences that no fortune in the world can undo. Because what happened that afternoon in the courtyard of that mansion was not an accident. It was not bad luck. It was the inevitable outcome of a series of choices that began long before, in the mind of a man who believed himself above the laws of nature. The lion had a name. They called him Apollo, a name that evoked God's power, eternity. But Apollo was not a god. He was a wild predator living in a golden cage, surrounded by luxury he could never understand, fed by hands that believed love could be bought with meat and caresses. And the boy was named Christopher, 4 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes like the sky that morning, a child who had grown up seeing that enormous feline as part of his world, as natural as the sculptures in the garden or the fountain that never stopped flowing. What the cameras captured that day has never been shown to the public. The family paid millions to ensure those images would never see the light. But the truth always finds a way to emerge. And today, you are about to discover what really happened in those 5 minutes that changed everything. Because behind the story lies a revelation about human nature, about the price of arrogance, about what happens when we confuse power with control. Right now, you're at a crossroads. You can continue with your day, never knowing what happened in that courtyard. Or you can stay and discover a truth that will force you to question everything you thought you knew about the relationship between humans and wild animals. If you choose to stay, I ask you to leave a like on this video. Not for me, not for the algorithm, but so that more people can discover this story that the powerful tried to bury. And in the comments, write, "I'm ready to uncover the hidden truth." Because by doing so, you become part of a community that doesn't settle for the official version, that seeks to understand what few dare to reveal. Congratulations. You're here because you're not afraid of uncomfortable truths. Because you understand that the most important stories are often the ones that are never told. Get ready. What comes next contains a revelation that will forever change how you see the relationship between humans and wild animals, and how a single decision, made in a moment of vanity, can unleash a tragedy that no amount of money can erase. Richard Vandermeer didn't become a billionaire by chance. At 53 years old, he had built an empire in the tech industry, starting with a small software company in his garage and transforming it into a multinational corporation valued at over $8 billion. He had 3 mansions, a collection of classic cars that made collectors around the world envious, a yacht anchored in Monaco, and a private plane. But for Richard, none of that was enough. Because in his world, in the exclusive circle of the ultra-wealthy, where he moved, uniqueness was the true currency. And what could be more unique than having a lion as a pet? The idea came to him during a business dinner in Dubai. One of his associates, a Saudi oil magnate, casually mentioned that he kept 2 Bengal tigers on his property. Not in a zoo, not in a sanctuary, in his home, as if they were Labrador dogs. Richard felt something stir inside him. It wasn't envy exactly. It was more primal. It was the need to prove that he too could possess something that defied all logic, all norms, all common sense. 6 months later, Apollo arrived at the Vandermeer mansion. He was just 3 months old, a ball of tawny fur with enormous paws and eyes that still held the innocence of childhood. Richard paid $250,000 for him to a dealer who specialized in exotic animals, a man with contacts in African breeding facilities and a flexible enough morality to ask no questions. The transaction was illegal in 12 different ways, but money has a wonderful ability to make legal problems disappear. Richard's wife, Victoria, was horrified from the beginning. "This is madness," she told him the night Apollo arrived. "It's a wild animal, Richard. Not a dog. Not a cat. A predator." But Richard dismissed her concerns with the same arrogance he used to dismiss warnings from his lawyers and financial advisors. "I've conquered the technology market," he replied. "I've built an empire from nothing. Do you really think I can't handle a cat?" That's how he referred to Apollo in those early days. The cat. As if minimizing what he was could change his true nature. Christopher was born a year before Apollo's arrival. When the lion came into his life, the boy was barely walking, still exploring the world with the clumsy curiosity of a toddler. Richard thought it would be perfect. "They'll grow up together," he said to Victoria, ignoring the terror in her eyes. "Christopher will learn to respect nature, to understand that we can coexist with any creature if we do it right." The irony of those words would become evident later, in the worst possible way. The first 2 years were, surprisingly, peaceful. Apollo grew at an astonishing rate. At 6 months, he already weighed 40 kilograms. At a year, 90. At 18 months, he had reached 150 kilograms of pure muscle, claws, and teeth designed by millions of years of evolution to kill. But he had never shown aggression toward the family. The trainers Richard hired, yes, he hired trainers, as if that could domesticate millennia of predatory instinct, assured him that Apollo was exceptionally docile. "It's rare to see a specimen so calm," they said, and Richard believed them, because it fit his narrative, because it confirmed what he wanted to believe, that he had succeeded where nature said he should fail. Christopher and Apollo developed what appeared to be a bond. The boy would approach the lion without fear, something that alarmed the staff but fascinated Richard. He would film those interactions on his phone, showing them to his friends at social gatherings. "Look at this," he'd say with pride. "My son and his lion." As if Apollo were a possession, an extension of his wealth, and not a creature with instincts that not even the most luxurious mansion could erase. But there were signs, small signals that something wasn't right. Apollo had begun to behave strangely in recent months. He paced in circles in his enclosure, a spacious area behind the mansion that Richard had built to give him freedom, as if 30 square meters could replace the African savanna. The lion stopped eating some days. Other days, he ate voraciously, as if he couldn't satisfy a hunger that had nothing to do with food. The trainers noticed it, but when they tried to talk to Richard about it, he dismissed them. "He's fine," he insisted. "He just needs to adjust." The morning of the incident, Victoria had tried one last time. "Richard, please," she begged him. "Something's not right with Apollo. I can feel it. Let's send him to a sanctuary, somewhere where he can be with other lions, where he can be what he really is." Richard looked at her with that mixture of pity and contempt he reserved for people he considered weak. "You're being dramatic," he told her. "Apollo is part of this family. We're not abandoning him because you're paranoid." That same afternoon, while Richard was in his office on a video conference with investors in Tokyo, while Victoria had gone out to get her nails done, while the nanny had stepped away for just 5 minutes to answer an urgent phone call, Christopher wandered into the courtyard. The security gate that should have kept him separated from Apollo's area was open. Nobody ever figured out if someone forgot to close it or if the boy, with the curious ingenuity of a 4-year-old, had learned to manipulate the latch. What is certain is that Christopher walked toward Apollo with the same confidence with which he had approached him hundreds of times before, carrying his toy cars, smiling, calling him in that high-pitched voice children have, "Apollo, Apollo." And the lion, lying in the sun, opened his eyes, those amber eyes that had seemed so docile, so domesticated, so harmless. And something in them, something ancient and wild that had never really left, awakened. The security cameras in the Vandermeer Mansion's courtyard were state-of-the-art, capable of capturing images in 4K resolution even in low-light conditions. They recorded everything from multiple angles. Every second of what happened is there, stored on servers that Richard would later try to destroy, without success, because certain truths refuse to be erased, no matter how much money you throw at them. At 3:47 p.m., Christopher entered the courtyard through the side door. He was wearing his favorite shorts, the blue ones with white stripes, and a yellow t-shirt with a dinosaur on the front. In his small hands, he carried 3 toy cars, a red fire truck, a green race car, and a blue police car. The cameras captured how he stopped for a moment at the edge of Apollo's area, looking at the lion with that mixture of affection and fascination that had characterized all his previous interactions. Apollo was lying in his usual spot, a shaded area under an oak tree that Richard had specifically left when building the enclosure. From a distance, the scene could have been from a children's movie. The innocent boy, the majestic lion, the perfect afternoon sun, filtering through the leaves. But what the cameras showed was something else. If you looked carefully, and the experts who later analyzed the footage did, you could see tension in Apollo's body. His tail, which usually rested relaxed, was moving slightly. His ears, normally drooping, were tilted forward, signs that any zoologist would have recognized immediately as indicators of alert. But Christopher didn't know how to read those signs. He was 4 years old. His world was still a place where lions could be friends, where danger was an abstract concept, where trust was unlimited. At 3:48 p.m., the boy began walking toward Apollo. Not running, walking calmly, as he had done so many times before. "Apollo," he called in his child's voice. "Apollo, look what I brought." He held up the toy cars as if they were offerings. And Apollo, for his part, raised his head, slowly, his yellow eyes fixed on the small figure approaching him. What happened in the lion's brain at that moment, no one will ever know with certainty. Perhaps it was hunger. He hadn't eaten that morning, something the staff had noted in the daily log. Perhaps it was stress accumulated over months of captivity, of living in a space that, however luxurious, could never replace his natural habitat. Perhaps it was simply instinct, that ancient programming that dictates that a small moving creature is prey. Or perhaps it was a combination of all those factors, a perfect storm of predatory circumstances that converged in those precise seconds. At 3:49 p.m., when Christopher was 10 meters away, Apollo stood up. It was a fluid motion, almost graceful, 190 kilograms of muscle and power, moving with a precision that spoke of millions of years of evolution perfected for one purpose: hunting. But even then, to an inexperienced eye, it didn't necessarily seem alarming. Apollo often stood up when Christopher approached. Sometimes he would walk toward the boy, let himself be petted, even lie down so Christopher could lean against his belly. But this time was different. Christopher kept walking, unaware. 5 meters, 4 meters, 3 meters. The cameras captured the exact moment when everything changed. Apollo lowered his body into a crouch. It was a subtle movement, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable for anyone who understood feline behavior. It was the posture of a hunter preparing to launch. At 3:50 p.m., Christopher was 2 meters away when he stopped. Perhaps some primitive instinct, something inherited from his own ancestors, who had learned to fear predators to survive, made him hesitate. The smile on his face faltered slightly. "Apollo," he said, but this time his voice sounded different, smaller, less sure. And then Apollo moved. Felines are among the fastest animals in the world when launching an attack at short distance. A lion can cover 10 meters in less than 2 seconds. Apollo covered the 2 meters, separating him from Christopher in a fraction of a second. The cameras captured it as a golden blur of motion, so fast that, when watching the footage frame by frame, you can see the exact moment when the afternoon light reflecting off his fur creates a halo that looks almost supernatural. The impact knocked Christopher to the ground. The toy cars flew through the air, scattering across the marble tiles of the courtyard. The red fire truck rolled until it hit the fountain. The green race car skidded under a bench. The blue police car, Christopher's favorite, landed in the grass and remained there, upright, as if watching what happened next. Apollo's weight, nearly 50 times the boy's, pinned Christopher against the ground. The lion's massive paws, each the size of a dinner plate, rested on the child's small chest. And his jaws, those jaws designed to crush the spines of zebras and wildebeest, opened. The cameras captured Christopher's scream. It was a sound that would later be described by psychologists analyzing the footage as the most disturbing thing they had ever heard in their professional careers. It wasn't just fear. It was the primal terror of a creature that suddenly understands it's about to die. But then something extraordinary happened. At 3:51 p.m., exactly 1 minute and 4 seconds after Apollo had moved, the lion froze. His jaws, which had been centimeters from Christopher's face, stopped. His eyes, those amber eyes that had shown the cold calculation of a predator, seemed to change. It was as if something inside him, some vestige of the 2 years of coexistence, of the hundreds of times Christopher had approached him without fear, of the hands that had fed him, broke through the wall of instinct. Apollo didn't bite. He didn't close his jaws around the child's head. He didn't do what millions of years of evolution dictated he should do. Instead, he began to make a sound. It wasn't a roar. It was something else. Something deeper and more guttural. A sound that experts who later listened to the footage described as confusion. As if the lion himself didn't understand what was happening. As if he were trapped between two natures. The wild predator and the domesticated creature he had been forced to become. Christopher was crying, sobbing with that intensity only children can achieve, when terror consumes them completely. His small body trembled under Apollo's weight. His hands, those tiny hands, pushed ineffectively against the lion's chest, like trying to move a mountain. And Apollo, for his part, remained still, frozen in a moment of indecision that would define everything that came next. The nanny heard the scream first. Her name was Elena, a 52-year-old woman who had worked for the Vandermeer family for 3 years. She was in the kitchen, 2 rooms away from the courtyard, talking on the phone with her daughter about medical bills. When Christopher's scream pierced the air, Elena dropped the phone. She didn't hang up. She simply let it fall from her hands, and her daughter's voice kept talking into the void, unaware that on the other end, a catastrophe was unfolding. Elena ran. Later, she would tell investigators that she didn't remember making the decision to run. Her body simply moved, propelled by an instinct more powerful than thought. She crossed the hallway, pushed open the glass door that led to the courtyard, and what she saw made her freeze for a fraction of a second that felt like an eternity. Christopher was on the ground. Apollo was on top of him. The scene was a nightmare made real, the materialization of every fear Victoria had expressed for 2 years, every warning the experts had given, every vestige of common sense that Richard had ignored in his arrogance. Elena screamed. It was a scream different from Christopher's. While the boy's scream had been pure terror, Elena's was something more complex. Horror, desperation, and rage mixed into a sound that seemed too large to come from a single human being. And that scream did something Christopher's hadn't done. It made Apollo react. The lion turned his head toward Elena. His eyes found hers. And in that exchange of gazes, something primal happened. Because while Apollo might be confused about what Christopher represented, friend, prey, something he didn't have the category to understand, there was no confusion about what Elena was. She was a threat, an adult human running toward him, screaming, with her hands raised. Apollo released Christopher. He didn't do it gently. His paw, as he shifted his weight, struck the boy's chest with a force that would later be found to have cracked 2 of his ribs. Christopher rolled to the side, crying, gasping, his small body going into shock. And Apollo turned toward Elena. What happened in the next 30 seconds would be analyzed by experts in wild animal behavior for years, because Apollo didn't immediately attack Elena. Instead, he adopted a posture that seemed almost defensive. His body lowered, his ears flattened against his skull. A low growl emerged from his chest, a sound that seemed to make the air in the courtyard vibrate. Elena stopped running, not because she wanted to, but because her body refused to obey. She was 5 meters from the lion, 5 meters from Christopher, and every cell in her body was screaming at her to run away, to save herself, to abandon the boy and preserve her own life. But she didn't. Instead, she did something that experts would later call incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. She spread her arms, making herself appear larger, and began shouting, "No! Apollo, no! Bad! Bad!" As if he were a dog. As if words could undo what was already in motion. Apollo took a step toward her, then another. His muscles rippled under his golden fur, each movement a display of contained power. His eyes never left Elena's, and she, for her part, continued shouting, continued keeping her arms raised, continued being a barrier between the lion and the child who was now trying to crawl away, leaving a trail of tears and small drops of blood on the marble. Where was Richard during all this? In his office on the 3rd floor, with noise-canceling headphones, while on a video conference. Where was Victoria? In a beauty salon 15 minutes away, blissfully unaware that her worst nightmare was coming true. Where were the security guards Richard paid $50,000 a year each? One was on his lunch break. The other was at the main entrance, too far to hear the screams. Elena was alone, a 52-year-old woman who weighed 60 kilos, facing a creature that could kill her with a single swipe of its paw. But then, something unexpected happened. From inside the mansion, another sound emerged. The barking of dogs. The Vandermeer family had 3 small dogs, Pomeranians that Victoria adored and Richard tolerated. The barking, high-pitched and persistent, reached the courtyard, and Apollo, his head turned toward the sound, seemed confused. It was the opportunity Elena needed. "Christopher," she shouted. "Christopher, get up. Run to me. Now." Her voice came out as a command, charged with an authority that cut through the boy's state of shock. Christopher, moving with automatic movements, stood up. His legs trembled. His face was covered in tears and dirt. But he started moving. Apollo noticed. His head snapped back toward the boy, and Elena saw the moment when the predator in him reactivated. "No!" she screamed, and did the only thing she could think of. She took off her shoe, a simple canvas shoe, and threw it at the lion. It was a ridiculous gesture. The shoe weighed maybe 200 grams. It hit Apollo on the flank and bounced off harmlessly. But it had the desired effect. The lion's attention returned to Elena, and Christopher kept moving. 1 step, 2, 3, each one an eternity, each one a miracle. When the boy finally reached Elena, she grabbed him with one arm, pressing him against her body, never taking her eyes off Apollo. The lion watched them. He took another step forward, then stopped. His tail moved from side to side in an agitated motion. A sound emerged from his throat, something between a growl and a whimper. And then, inexplicably, Apollo turned around. He walked back to his spot under the oak tree. He lay down and closed his eyes, as if nothing had happened. Elena didn't wait to understand why. With Christopher in her arms, she ran toward the mansion. The boy weighed nearly 20 kilos, but adrenaline made him feel light as a feather. She crossed the courtyard, entered through the glass door, slammed it shut behind her, and only then, only when there was a physical barrier between them and the lion, did she allow herself to collapse. She sat on the floor, Christopher still in her arms, both crying now. The boy's chest rose and fell rapidly. His breaths came in short gasps. Blood was beginning to appear through his yellow t-shirt, where Apollo's claws had punctured the skin in 4 parallel lines. It was at that moment that Richard finally appeared, having removed his headphones upon hearing the dogs barking. "What's going on?" he asked, irritated by the interruption. And then he saw them. Elena on the floor, Christopher bleeding, the open door to the courtyard, and beyond, through the glass, Apollo lying under his tree, as if he were just a big lazy cat enjoying the afternoon sun. The color drained from Richard's face. What happened?" he whispered. But he already knew. Deep down, in a place he had refused to acknowledge for 2 years, he had always known this moment would come. The ambulance arrived 23 minutes after Elena called 911. 23 minutes during which Christopher remained in Elena's arms, trembling, crying, repeating the same word over and over. "Mama, mama, mama." But Victoria still wasn't there. She was stuck in traffic, her phone ringing incessantly with calls from Richard that she couldn't answer because she was driving, unaware that each ring carried a universe of desperation. The paramedics found Christopher in a state of shock, but, miraculously, without life-threatening injuries. Apollo's claws had left 4 deep gashes on his chest, wounds that would require stitches and would leave scars for the rest of his life. 2 cracked ribs, multiple contusions, and psychological trauma that doctors said would be impossible to quantify at that moment but would undoubtedly manifest in the weeks, months, and years to come. "You're incredibly lucky," one of the paramedics told Richard while they stabilized Christopher. "If that lion had wanted to kill him, nothing could have stopped him. The fact that your son is alive is, honestly, I don't know what it is. A miracle, maybe." But Richard didn't feel lucky. He felt like the world was collapsing around him, as if all the certainty he had built his life upon had revealed itself as a lie. Victoria arrived at the hospital 37 minutes after the ambulance departed. She burst through the emergency room doors like a hurricane. Her perfect makeup smeared by tears, she had begun crying the moment Richard finally managed to explain what had happened over the phone. "Where is he?" she screamed at the receptionist. "Where's my son?" When she finally saw Christopher in a hospital bed, his small chest wrapped in bandages, his face pale, and his eyes red from crying, something inside her broke. She collapsed beside him, hugging him with a desperation that spoke of every nightmare she had imagined during the 2 years Apollo had been in their home. "My baby," she sobbed. "My baby, my baby, my baby." Richard watched from the doorway. He wanted to enter. He wanted to hug his son, to hug his wife, to somehow undo what had happened. But he couldn't move. Because he knew. He knew this was his fault. Every decision that had led to this moment had been his. The arrogance, the pride, the blind belief that money could buy control over nature. The doctors kept Christopher under observation for 48 hours. The physical wounds were concerning, but what truly worried them was the psychological trauma. "He's not talking," the psychologist assigned to his case told Victoria and Richard. "Not about what happened. He's withdrawn into himself. This is common in children who have experienced severe trauma. The mind creates protective barriers. But we need to work through this carefully, or the psychological damage could be permanent." During those 48 hours, while Christopher slept sedated in his hospital bed, Richard had to face reality in a way he had avoided his entire life. Animal control arrived at the mansion 6 hours after the incident. They were accompanied by police, wildlife experts, and a lawyer representing the state's environmental department. "Mr. Vandermeer," said the lead animal control officer, a woman in her 40s with hard eyes and a voice that tolerated no nonsense. "You're aware that possessing a lion as a pet is illegal in this state, correct?" Richard nodded mutely. "You're also aware that this animal has attacked a minor, which makes it a public safety threat?" Another nod. "Then you'll understand that we have no choice but to seize the animal and evaluate whether it needs to be euthanized." The word euthanized hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. "Wait," he said. "There must be another option. A sanctuary, a zoo, somewhere that can take him." The officer looked at him with something resembling pity. "Mr. Vandermeer, once a wild animal has attacked a human, especially a child, the protocol is very clear. The animal is considered too dangerous to be relocated. The risk is too high." "But he didn't kill him," Richard protested, his voice rising. "Apollo had the opportunity. He had my son under his paws, and he didn't kill him. That has to mean something." The officer sighed. "What it means, Mr. Vandermeer, is that you're lucky your son is alive. But luck isn't a conservation strategy. That lion is a ticking time bomb, and what happened today is proof that your judgment regarding this animal has been catastrophically flawed." They tranquilized Apollo with a dart shot from a safe distance. The lion fell asleep under his oak tree, the same spot where he had laid down after releasing Christopher. Animal control loaded him into a reinforced transport vehicle. Richard watched from a window on the 3rd floor, unable to face going down, unable to look Apollo in the eyes one last time. And then they took him away. The lion that was supposed to be a symbol of his power, his uniqueness, his superiority over normal people who couldn't possess such things. They took him away, and Richard knew he would never see him again. The legal consequences came quickly. The district attorney filed charges: illegal possession of a wild animal, child endangerment, reckless endangerment. Richard's lawyers, some of the best money could buy, managed to negotiate probation, a massive fine, community service, and absolute prohibition from ever owning an exotic animal again. "You're getting off easy," his lead lawyer told him. "If that child had died, you'd be looking at manslaughter charges. Maybe even murder, given the recklessness involved. But the legal consequences were nothing compared to what happened in his family. Victoria moved to the guest room. She couldn't look at Richard without seeing what could have happened, without seeing her son's face when Apollo had him pinned to the ground. "I told you," she said one night, her voice flat and emotionless. "I told you from the beginning. But you didn't listen. You never listen. Because you always think you know better, that you're smarter. That rules don't apply to you." "Victoria, Richard began, but she cut him off. "No, I don't want your apologies. I don't want your explanations. I want you to understand something. Our son almost died because of your ego, and I will never forgive you for that. Never." The question of what to do with Apollo hung over them. The experts evaluated him for 3 days. Their conclusion was unanimous. The lion showed signs of severe stress from captivity, inadequate socialization, and unpredictable behavior. "He's not suitable for relocation to a sanctuary," the report stated. "The risk to handlers and other animals is too high. Additionally, he has not developed the skills needed to integrate into a lion social group. He's essentially a creature caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither." The implication was clear. Apollo's fate was sealed. "He'll be euthanized humanely," the animal control officer informed Richard over the phone. "It will happen this afternoon." "I thought you want to know." Richard thanked her and hung up. He sat in his office, the same office where he'd been on that video conference while his son's life hung in the balance, and cried for the first time since he was a child. Because regardless of everything that had happened, regardless of the terrible mistake he had made, Apollo had been a living being under his care. And now that living being would die because Richard had pulled him from his natural world to satisfy his own vanity. 3 weeks after the incident, when Christopher was back home, but still refusing to speak about what had happened, when Victoria was sleeping in a separate room and barely speaking to Richard, when the house felt like a tomb of broken dreams and shattered certainties, a man named Dr. Marcus Wilhelm appeared at the Vandermeer mansion. He was a wildlife behavioral psychologist from the University of California, one of the world's leading experts on human-animal interactions, particularly regarding wild animals kept in captivity. "Mr. Vandermeer," he said when Richard reluctantly agreed to meet with him, "I've spent my career studying cases like yours, animals that attack humans, the circumstances surrounding those attacks, the behavioral patterns that precede them. And I have to tell you, your case is one of the most fascinating I've encountered." Richard bristled at the word fascinating, as if his family's tragedy were some academic curiosity. But Dr. Wilhelm continued, seemingly oblivious to Richard's discomfort. "You see, most attacks by captive wild animals fall into predictable categories. The animal is starved or abused or suddenly triggered by something in its environment. But Apollo is different." He opened a briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "I obtained access to the security footage. I hope you don't mind. It's part of a study I'm conducting on predatory behavior in non-wild settings. And what I found is extraordinary." He pulled out several printouts, freeze frames from the footage. "Look here. This is the moment Apollo had your son pinned. See his jaw position? His body tension? This is a predator who has captured prey. But look at what happens next." Dr. Wilhelm shuffled through the images. His jaw opens, but it doesn't close. His pupils dilate, but not in the way they do when a lion is in full predatory mode. And most importantly, listen to this. He pulled out a small digital recorder and pressed play. The sound that emerged was the guttural vocalization Apollo had made while Christopher was beneath him. "I've analyzed this sound," Dr. Wilhelm continued. "I've compared it to thousands of lion vocalizations in my database. And you know what? It doesn't match any standard category. It's not a roar. It's not a threat display. It's not a hunting call. If I had to classify it, I'd say it's closest to the sounds lion cubs make when they're confused or distressed, as if Apollo himself didn't understand what he was doing." Richard sat in silence, processing this information. "What are you saying?" he finally asked. "That Apollo was, what? Fighting with himself?" "In essence, yes," Dr. Wilhelm replied. "You see, what you attempted to do, Raising a wild predator in a domestic environment creates a profound psychological conflict in the animal. Apollo spent his formative months, the period when lions typically learn to hunt from their mothers and integrate into a pride, in your mansion. He was fed by hand. He was petted. He was treated like a pet. But his DNA, millions of years of evolution, was telling him something completely different. The psychologist leaned forward. When Christopher approached him that day, Apollo's predatory instinct activated. A small creature moving toward him triggered an automatic response. But simultaneously, 2 years of conditioning, of associating humans, especially small Christopher, with safety and care, created a counterimpulse. Apollo was literally fighting against himself, his nature versus his nurture, happening in real time. Then why did he attack at all? Richard demanded. If he had this bond with Christopher, why didn't that stop him completely? Dr. Wilhelm sighed. Because you can't erase instinct, Mr. Vandermeer. You can suppress it, you can manage it, but it's always there, waiting. And stress, the stress of captivity, of living in an environment completely unsuited to his nature, was breaking down Apollo's ability to control those instincts. The signs were all there. The pacing you mentioned, the changes in appetite, the periods of withdrawal. These are classic indicators of an animal in psychological distress. He pulled out another document. I also interviewed Elena, your nanny. She told me something interesting. She said that in the days before the attack, Apollo had been watching Christopher differently, not with the usual calm indifference, but with intense focus, as if he were studying the boy. That's predatory behavior emerging. Apollo was beginning to see Christopher not as a companion, but as potential prey. Richard felt sick. We should have seen it. I should have seen it. Yes, Dr. Wilhelm agreed, without mercy. You should have. But this is the problem with exotic pet ownership, Mr. Vandermeer. People think that because an animal appears docile, because it hasn't attacked yet, that it never will. They mistake the absence of violence for the absence of danger. They don't understand that every day an animal like Apollo doesn't attack is simply a day where the balance of factors hasn't tipped in that direction yet. The psychologist stood up, preparing to leave. The real tragedy here isn't just what happened to your son, Mr. Vandermeer. It's what happened to Apollo. You took a creature designed to roam hundreds of square miles of savanna, to live in complex social structures with other lions, to hunt and fight, and mate according to patterns refined over millions of years. And you put him in a golden cage, and expected him to be happy, to be safe, to be something he could never be. Apollo was euthanized, Richard said quietly, 3 days after the attack. I know, Dr. Wilhelm replied. I read the report. They used a lethal injection. He died peacefully, which is more than many captive wild animals can say. But here's what haunts me, Mr. Vandermeer. In those final moments before he was euthanized, do you know what the handlers reported? Apollo was calm, docile. He let them approach without resistance, as if some part of him understood that this was the end, and perhaps he was even relieved. The words hung in the air like a curse. Dr. Wilhelm picked up his briefcase. I'm publishing a paper on this case. All names will be anonymized, of course, but the world needs to understand what happens when we try to make wild things tame. Not for our amusement or education, but as a warning. Because you're not the first person to make this mistake, Mr. Vandermeer. And unless people learn, you won't be the last. After he left, Richard sat alone in his office for hours. Outside, the sun set over the courtyard where it had all happened. The oak tree was still there. Apollo's enclosure remained, though it was now empty, a monument to Richard's arrogance. And somewhere in the house, his son, his beautiful, traumatized son, was trying to learn how to be a child again, trying to forget the feeling of a predator's weight on his chest. Christopher's silence became the new normal in the Vandermeer household. For 6 weeks after the attack, the boy who had once been vibrant and talkative, who had filled the mansion with his laughter and endless questions about everything, said nothing, not to his mother, not to his father, not to Elena, who he had clung to in the ambulance and who now felt an unbreakable bond with the child she had saved. The psychologists called it selective mutism, a trauma response where the mind simply shuts down certain functions to protect itself from processing unbearable experiences. He'll talk when he's ready, they assured Victoria. Pushing him will only make it worse. What he needs now is safety, routine, and the knowledge that he's protected. But while Christopher's mouth was silent, his nightmares spoke volumes. Every night, sometimes multiple times per night, his screams would pierce the darkness. Victoria would rush to his room to find him sitting up in bed, eyes open but not seeing, trapped in some hellish replay of those 5 minutes in the courtyard. She would hold him, rock him, whisper that he was safe, that everything was okay, that the lion was gone and would never come back. But was everything okay? Could everything ever truly be okay again? The physical scars were healing. The 4 parallel lines on Christopher's chest, where Apollo's claws had torn through his yellow t-shirt and into his flesh, were fading from angry red to pink. The cracked ribs had mended, but the invisible scars, those were a different story. Christopher refused to go outside. Any attempt to take him into the garden, even just to the front lawn where Apollo had never been, would send him into a panic. His small body would go rigid, his breathing would become rapid and shallow, and his eyes would fill with a terror that broke Victoria's heart every time she saw it. He also developed new fears. Loud noises made him flinch. Dogs barking, even the Pomeranians he had once played with, sent him running to hide. And animals on television were absolutely forbidden. The first time Victoria tried to put on a nature documentary, hoping it might help Christopher process what had happened in a controlled way, the boy had vomited. Simply the sight of a lion on the screen, even though it was obviously just an image, had triggered such a visceral physical response that Victoria had vowed never to make that mistake again. Richard tried to help, but his presence seemed to make things worse. Christopher would tense whenever his father entered the room. The boy wouldn't make eye contact, and on the few occasions when Richard tried to hug his son, Christopher's entire body would go rigid, as if he were bracing for an attack. Victoria saw the pain this caused Richard, but she couldn't bring herself to feel sympathy. This was his fault. All of it. Every nightmare, every moment of terror, every day that Christopher remained trapped in his own silence. It was all because Richard had to have his exotic pet, his trophy, his proof that he was different from ordinary people. 7 weeks after the attack, something changed. It was a Tuesday morning, and Victoria was making breakfast. Simple things, Christopher's favorites, trying to tempt an appetite that had shrunk to almost nothing. Elena was helping, the 2 women moving in the comfortable silence of shared trauma, united by what they had been through. Christopher was sitting at the kitchen table, pushing scrambled eggs around his plate without eating them, when suddenly he spoke. Just one word, so quiet that at first Victoria thought she had imagined it. Apollo. Victoria froze, the coffee pot still in her hand. Elena's eyes widened. They looked at each other, then at Christopher. The boy was staring at his plate, but his lips were moving. Apollo didn't mean to hurt me. The words came out in a whisper, but they might as well have been shouted. Victoria set down the coffee pot with shaking hands and knelt beside her son's chair. Christopher, she said softly, can you say that again, sweetheart? The boy looked up at her, and for the first time in weeks, there was something in his eyes besides fear. It was confusion and sadness, and something that looked almost like guilt. Apollo didn't mean to hurt me, Christopher repeated, tears beginning to stream down his face. He was scared. I saw it in his eyes. He was scared, Mama, and I made him scared because I walked to him when I shouldn't have. It's my fault. I made Apollo do it. The words broke something loose in Victoria. She pulled Christopher into her arms, holding him while he sobbed, really sobbed, for the first time since the attack. No, baby, no, she whispered fiercely into his hair. None of this was your fault. Do you hear me? None of it. You're a child. You didn't do anything wrong. Apollo was a wild animal, and he should never have been here. That's not your fault. It's not Apollo's fault. She stopped herself before saying it was Richard's fault, but Christopher finished the sentence anyway, with a wisdom beyond his 4 years. It's Daddy's fault, the boy whispered, because he brought Apollo here when he should have been in Africa. Out of the mouths of babes, Victoria thought. Her 4-year-old son had arrived at the truth that Richard still seemed unable to fully accept. That evening, Victoria insisted that Richard sit down with Christopher and her for a conversation. Richard looked terrible. He had lost weight. His face was gaunt, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of his own sleepless nights. But Victoria felt no pity, only a cold determination that certain things needed to be said. "Christopher has something to tell you," Victoria said to Richard, her voice formal and distant, "and you're going to listen to all of it without interrupting." Christopher, sitting between them on the couch, his small body, seeming even smaller in the vast living room, spoke in that same quiet voice. He told his father about the nightmares, about being afraid to go outside, about the guilt he felt, that irrational, heartbreaking guilt that children feel when bad things happen around them, as if they somehow caused it. And then he said something that made Richard's eyes fill with tears. "Daddy, I miss Apollo. I know he hurt me, but I miss him. Is that bad? Does that make me bad?" "No," Richard choked out. "No, Christopher, that doesn't make you bad. That makes you better than I am. Because I've spent 7 weeks being angry at Apollo. But you're right. He didn't mean to hurt you. I hurt you. By bringing him here. By ignoring every warning. By thinking I could control something that was never meant to be controlled." Richard got down on his knees in front of his son, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. "I'm so sorry, Christopher. I'm sorry for what happened to you. I'm sorry for being arrogant enough to think I could keep a lion in our home. And I'm sorry that Apollo had to die because of my mistake." "Apollo's dead?" Christopher's voice cracked. "You didn't tell me Apollo was dead." Victoria shot Richard a furious look. They had agreed not to tell Christopher about the euthanasia. At least not yet. Not until he was stronger. "Yes," Richard said quietly. "After the attack, they took Apollo away. And they decided he was too dangerous to live anywhere else. So they put him to sleep. Peacefully. He didn't suffer." Christopher began crying again, but these tears were different. They were tears of grief, not trauma. "It's not fair," he sobbed. "Apollo should be in Africa. He should be with other lions. It's not fair that he died because of what I did." "Because of what I did," Richard corrected firmly. "Christopher, I need you to understand this. What happened was not your fault. You were a child playing in your own home. You had every right to feel safe. The fact that you didn't, that's on me. Only me." The confession, if it could be called that, didn't bring the closure Richard had hoped for. If anything, it opened new wounds. Christopher continued to struggle, his recovery a slow and painful process measured in tiny increments. A day without nightmares became cause for celebration. A trip to the front yard, just 5 steps beyond the door, was treated as a major victory. And the first time he laughed again, a small, brief sound while watching a cartoon that featured no animals whatsoever, Victoria cried with relief. But the family was fracturing in ways that couldn't be fixed with apologies. Victoria filed for separation 9 weeks after the attack. "I can't do this anymore," she told Richard, her voice empty of emotion, as if she had cried out every feeling she had left. "I can't look at you without seeing Christopher on the ground. I can't live in this house knowing what happened here. I can't pretend that we can just move forward from this." "Victoria, please," Richard begged. "I know I made a terrible mistake, but we can get through this. Families survive tragedies. We can." "This wasn't a tragedy, Richard," Victoria interrupted, her voice sharp now. "A tragedy is when something unavoidable happens. A car accident, an illness, an act of God. This was a preventable disaster that happened because you were too arrogant to listen to anyone who told you it was a bad idea. Do you know what the psychologist told me last week? She said Christopher has PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. My 4-year-old son has the same condition as war veterans, because of a choice you made." She took a breath, steadying herself. "I'm taking Christopher. We're moving to my sister's house in Connecticut. You can see him, supervised visits, but I don't want him anywhere near this mansion. I don't want him in this city. I want him somewhere far from everything that reminds him of what happened." Richard didn't fight her. How could he? She was right about everything. The divorce proceedings were quiet and quick. Richard's lawyers advised him not to contest anything. Given the circumstances, his lead attorney explained, any judge is going to be sympathetic to your wife. The fact that she's not seeking sole custody is actually generous. If this went to trial, the details would become public, and you do not want that. Trust me. So Richard agreed to everything. Victoria got primary custody. The Connecticut house. He bought her a new one, far from his sister's place, somewhere Christopher could have a fresh start. A generous alimony and child support arrangement. Everything she asked for, he gave. Money couldn't fix what he had broken, but it was all he had left to offer. The mansion became unbearable. Every room held memories now. The courtyard was the worst. Richard had considered filling in Apollo's enclosure, removing the oak tree, erasing any evidence that the lion had ever been there. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was the feeling that he deserved to live with this reminder of his failure. So the enclosure remained, empty and haunting. His business began to suffer. Richard had built his empire on focus and determination, but now he couldn't concentrate. Board meetings passed in a blur. Important decisions were delayed. His partners began to notice. "Richard, are you okay?" they would ask, with varying degrees of genuine concern. "You seem distracted lately." Distracted, as if his entire world hadn't shattered, as if his son wasn't traumatized, as if his wife hadn't left him, as if he hadn't caused the death of a magnificent creature that had never asked to be imprisoned in a mansion. The media eventually caught wind of the story. It started with a small local news article. Exotic pet attack raises questions about wild animal ownership. Then a larger regional story. Then national coverage. Then international. Journalists showed up at the mansion's gates. Camera crews parked on the street. Richard's lawyers issued statements. This was a private family matter. Mr. Vandermeer deeply regrets the incident and has cooperated fully with authorities. The family asks for privacy during this difficult time. But privacy was impossible. The story had everything the media loved: wealth, danger, hubris, a child in peril. Think pieces appeared. Why rich people's exotic pets are a public danger. The psychology of exotic animal ownership. What Christopher Vandermeer's trauma teaches us about wild animals. Richard stopped reading the news. He stopped going to his office. He moved through the mansion like a ghost, haunted by his own choices. It was during one of his sleepless nights, 3 months after the attack, that Richard found himself in his study, going through old files on his computer. Pictures and videos of Apollo's first months in the mansion. The lion as a cub, so small and adorable, being bottle-fed by staff. Apollo growing, learning to walk with more coordination, playing with toys like an oversized kitten. And videos of Christopher and Apollo together. Richard watched them now with different eyes. He saw what he hadn't seen before, or what he had seen but chosen to ignore. The way Apollo's body would tense, just slightly, when Christopher got close. The way his eyes would track the boy's movements with an intensity that wasn't affection but calculation. The signs of a predator tolerating a presence, not bonding with a friend. And in one video, taken just 2 weeks before the attack, Richard saw something that made his blood run cold. Christopher was playing near Apollo's enclosure, and the lion was watching him. Just watching. Not sleeping, not relaxed, but alert and focused. And there, for just a moment, Apollo lowered his body into that same crouching position, the hunting posture that Dr. Wilhelm had talked about. He didn't pounce. He didn't move. But the intent was there, visible in every line of his body. Richard had been there that day. He had filmed this video. He had seen Apollo crouch. And he had done nothing. He had dismissed it. Apollo's just stretching, he had said to himself. He's fine. The video ended, and Richard sat in the darkness of his study, the full weight of his culpability crushing down on him. He hadn't just made one mistake. He had made 1,000 mistakes, every single day, for 2 years. Every time he ignored a warning. Every time he dismissed a concern. Every time he believed that his wealth and willpower could override the fundamental nature of a wild animal. Christopher was alive because of luck, because Apollo had hesitated, because Elena had been brave, not because Richard had done anything right. The next morning, Richard made a call. "Dr. Wilhelm, it's Richard Vandermeer. I need to talk to someone. I need to understand what I did." Not for absolution. I know I don't deserve that. But because I need to make sure this never happens again, to anyone. And Dr. Wilhelm, to his credit, agreed to meet. Dr. Wilhelm came to the mansion on a gray Thursday afternoon, 3.5 months after the attack. Richard led him to the study, the same room where he had watched those damning videos of Apollo, showing predatory behavior that he had willfully ignored. The psychologist carried the same briefcase as before, but this time his expression was different. Less academic curiosity, more somber understanding. "Thank you for seeing me," Richard began, but Dr. Wilhelm waved off the gratitude. "Mr. Vandermeer, when you called, you said you needed to understand what you did. So let me be frank with you. What you did was engage in a form of cognitive dissonance so profound that it nearly killed your child. You took every piece of evidence that contradicted your belief, that Apollo could be domesticated, that this situation was safe, and you discarded it. You convinced yourself that wanting something to be true could make it true." Richard nodded slowly. "I've been going through old videos. I saw Apollo showing hunting behavior toward Christopher 2 weeks before the attack. I filmed it. I saw it with my own eyes. And I did nothing. Because acknowledging what you were seeing would have meant admitting you were wrong," Dr. Wilhelm said bluntly. "It would have meant facing the fact that your $250,000 exotic pet, your symbol of uniqueness and power, was actually a dangerous mistake. And your ego couldn't handle that." The words were harsh, but Richard found himself grateful for their honesty. "Tell me about Apollo," he said quietly. "Not about the attack. Tell me about what his life was like, psychologically. What did I do to him?" Dr. Wilhelm leaned back in his chair. "You want the truth. Apollo was probably miserable for most of his time here. Lions are social animals, Mr. Vandermeer. They live in prides. They have complex relationships with other lions, playing, hunting together, establishing hierarchies. Apollo had none of that. He was isolated in a way that goes against every instinct in his biology." "But he had us," Richard protested weakly. "He had human interaction." "Which is not the same thing at all," Dr. Wilhelm replied. "Imagine if you were raised by wolves. They might feed you, shelter you, even show you affection in their way. But you would never be a wolf. You would never understand their social cues perfectly. You would always be something in between, belonging fully to neither world. That was Apollo's existence. Too domesticated to survive in the wild, too wild to be truly domestic." The psychologist pulled out a tablet and brought up some documents. After Apollo was seized, the behavioral specialists who evaluated him noted several concerning signs. Stereotypic behavior, that pacing you mentioned, decreased appetite, and lethargy. What in humans we might call depression. Apollo wasn't thriving here, Mr. Vandermeer. He was surviving, and barely. "Then why did he seem happy sometimes?" Richard asked. "He played. He seemed relaxed. Animals are remarkable at adapting to adverse conditions," Dr. Wilhelm interrupted. "It's how they survive. Apollo learned to tolerate his environment. But tolerance isn't happiness. And the stress of that tolerance was building, creating psychological pressure that had to release somehow. The attack on Christopher was that release." Richard stood and walked to the window, looking out at the courtyard where it had all happened. The oak tree swayed in the wind, indifferent to the tragedy that had occurred beneath its branches. "What should I have done differently?" he asked, though he knew the answer. "You should never have bought him in the first place," Dr. Wilhelm said simply. "But failing that, you should have listened to experts. You should have sent him to a reputable sanctuary within the first few months, before he became too bonded to captivity. You should have prioritized your son's safety over your ego. You should have done 1,000 things differently, Mr. Vandermeer." "I know," Richard whispered. "I know that now." "Do you?" Dr. Wilhelm's voice was sharp. "Because here's what concerns me, Mr. Vandermeer. You're not unique. Every year, people like you, wealthy, powerful, convinced of their own exceptionalism, purchase exotic animals. And every year, some percentage of those situations end in tragedy. Children mauled, adults killed, animals destroyed because they did what nature programmed them to do." He stood and walked to stand beside Richard at the window. What happened to Christopher and Apollo is a symptom of a larger problem. It's the same arrogance that makes people think they can keep tigers in their backyards, or chimpanzees in their homes, or any number of wild creatures that evolution designed for environments we can never replicate. And usually, it's not the person who made the foolish decision who pays the price. It's an innocent child, or a delivery person who happens to come to the wrong door, or the animal itself, euthanized for following its instincts. What can I do? Richard asked. I can't undo what happened, but I have resources. I have money. There must be something. Dr. Wilhelm considered this. There is, actually. Use your platform. You're a billionaire, Mr. Vandermeer. You have influence. Speak out against exotic pet ownership. Fund sanctuaries that care for animals seized from situations like yours. Support legislation that makes it harder for people to make the same mistake you did. Turn your tragedy into something that might prevent others. The publicity, Richard said hesitantly. It would mean admitting your failure publicly. Dr. Wilhelm finished. Yes, it would mean facing judgment and criticism. It would mean your business partners and social circle knowing exactly what kind of mistake you made. But isn't that better than staying silent while more children get hurt? While more animals die? Richard thought about Christopher in Connecticut, slowly learning to be a child again. He thought about Apollo, euthanized in a cold facility, dying because Richard had pulled him into a world where he could never belong. He thought about Elena, who still had nightmares about what she saw in that courtyard, who had been forced into heroism because Richard's arrogance had created a situation where heroism was necessary. I'll do it, he said finally. Tell me what you need. Over the next weeks, Richard worked with Dr. Wilhelm and several animal welfare organizations to craft a public statement. It wasn't easy. His lawyers advised against it, warning of potential liability. His business partners expressed concern about the company's image. His publicist suggested a vaguer statement, one that didn't admit so much fault. But Richard ignored them all. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in his life, he chose honesty over self-preservation. The statement was released on a Tuesday morning, exactly 4 months after the attack. It was lengthy, detailed, and brutally honest. Richard described his thought process in buying Apollo. He admitted to ignoring warnings from experts. He took full responsibility for what happened to Christopher. He revealed the euthanization of Apollo and his own belief that the lion's death was a direct result of being placed in an impossible situation. And he pledged $10 million to establish a fund for exotic animal sanctuaries and advocacy for stronger laws regulating exotic pet ownership. The response was immediate and mixed. Some praised his honesty and willingness to take responsibility. Others said it was too little, too late, that no amount of money could undo the harm he had caused. Animal rights activists used his statement as ammunition in their ongoing campaigns. Parents' groups held him up as an example of what not to do. Richard read it all. Every comment, every article, every think piece. He didn't defend himself. He didn't argue. He simply accepted that this was part of his penance. One email, though, stood out. It was from Victoria. The subject line read simply, "Thank you." The message was brief. "Christopher saw your statement. He wanted me to tell you that he thinks you did the right thing. He still has nightmares. He still can't go near any large animals. But he's getting better. And knowing that maybe his suffering means other children won't have to suffer the same way. It helps him. It helps both of us. This doesn't fix what happened, Richard. But it's a start." Richard read the email 3 times, then saved it in a folder he titled Redemption. Not because he believed he had earned redemption, but because it represented the possibility that someday, somehow he might. 2 years after the attack, Richard stood in front of a congressional committee. The hearing room was packed with journalists, activists, and interested citizens. The topic, federal legislation to regulate private ownership of exotic animals. Richard had been invited to testify about his experience, to put a human face on the issue, to demonstrate what could happen when people treated wild animals as status symbols. "My name is Richard Vandermeer," he began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "And 2 years ago, I made a decision that nearly killed my son and did result in the death of a magnificent lion who deserved far better than what I gave him." He told the story. All of it. The committee members listened in silence. Some took notes. Others simply stared, their expressions ranging from sympathy to judgment to anger. Richard welcomed all of it. He deserved their judgment. He deserved much worse. "What I want this committee to understand," Richard continued, "is that I'm not a monster. I'm not some cartoon villain who wanted to cause harm. I was a successful businessman who thought he could control something that fundamentally cannot be controlled. I had resources, money, access to trainers and experts. And still it wasn't enough. Because you cannot domesticate millions of years of evolution with a large bank account." He pulled out a photograph, Christopher, taken just last month. The boy was 6 now, smiling in the picture, though Richard knew those smiles were still rare. "This is my son. He's in therapy 3 times a week. He still can't watch nature documentaries. He panics in zoos, even in the areas with small, harmless animals behind thick barriers. His childhood was stolen because I thought owning a lion would make me special." Richard's voice cracked, but he pushed forward. "I'm asking this committee to pass legislation that makes it significantly harder for people to make my mistake. Stronger regulations, better enforcement, severe penalties for illegal ownership, and support for sanctuaries that care for animals seized from situations like mine." The questions from committee members were pointed. One senator asked, "Mr. Vandermeer, critics say that you're only here because you got caught, that if the attack hadn't happened, you'd still have that lion. How do you respond?" "They're absolutely right," Richard replied without hesitation. "If Christopher hadn't been attacked, I would likely still have Apollo. I would still be telling myself that everything was fine, that the warnings didn't apply to me, that I was different. That's the insidious nature of this kind of arrogance. You don't see it until it's too late, which is exactly why legislation is necessary, because people like me won't regulate ourselves." Another committee member asked about his $10 million fund. "Some say this is just buying good publicity, that you're trying to rehabilitate your image." "My image is destroyed," Richard said flatly. "As it should be. The fund isn't about publicity. It's about trying to ensure that Apollo's death and my son's trauma result in something other than just pain. If that money can save even one child from going through what Christopher went through, or spare even one animal from Apollo's fate, then it's worth it." The hearing lasted 3 hours. Richard's testimony was just one part of a larger proceeding that included animal behaviorists, sanctuary directors, and other victims of exotic pet attacks. But his story, with its combination of wealth, privilege, and tragic consequences, captured the most media attention. The legislation passed 6 months later. It wasn't perfect. Compromises had been made. Loopholes existed, but it was progress. Stricter permitting requirements, mandatory inspections, higher penalties for violations, and federal funding for sanctuaries. Richard continued his advocacy work. He gave speeches, granted interviews, and worked with organizations fighting against exotic pet ownership. Each time he told the story, it hurt. Each time he saw the judgment in people's eyes, it stung. But he persisted, because this was his purpose now. This was what he could do with his wealth and platform that actually mattered. Christopher was getting better, slowly. The nightmares were less frequent. He had started a new school and made friends, though Victoria carefully vetted each friend's family, ensuring there were no exotic pets or even large dogs in their homes. The boy's therapist was optimistic. "He's resilient," she told Victoria. "The trauma will always be part of him, but it doesn't have to define him." Richard's relationship with his son remained complicated. They saw each other every other weekend, supervised visits that felt formal and uncomfortable. Christopher was polite but distant, as if Richard were an acquaintance rather than his father. Richard accepted this. He had forfeited the right to easy affection. If Christopher never fully forgave him, that was a consequence he had earned. On the 2nd anniversary of the attack, Richard did something he had been avoiding. He visited the facility where Apollo had been euthanized. It was a quiet building on the outskirts of the city, run by animal control, a place where dangerous or unsalvageable animals came to die. "Mr. Vandermeer," the director said when he arrived, "I wasn't expecting you." I needed to see where he died, Richard explained. I needed to. I don't know. Say goodbye properly, I suppose. The director led him to a small room. This is where we performed the euthanasia. It was peaceful, Mr. Vandermeer. I want you to know that. Apollo was sedated first. He didn't feel any pain. Richard stood in the sterile room, imagining Apollo's final moments. The big cat, confused perhaps, as strange humans approached with needles. The sedative taking effect, his massive body relaxing, his eyes closing. The final injection, stopping his heart, ending a life that should have roamed the African plains, but instead was confined to a mansion and finally this clinical room. I'm sorry, Richard whispered to the ghost of a lion. I'm so sorry for what I did to you. The director, to her credit, said nothing. What was there to say? Richard left the facility and drove to a nearby park. He sat on a bench, watching families play, children laughing, people living normal lives unmarked by the kind of tragedy he had brought into his world. He thought about Apollo, about Christopher, about Victoria, about Elena, about all the people whose lives had been changed by his decision to buy a lion. He pulled out his phone and looked at his bank account. Billions of dollars, more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. Money that had once represented power and freedom and the ability to do whatever he wanted. Now it just represented responsibility, the obligation to use these resources to prevent others from following his path. Richard made a call. Dr. Wilhelm? It's Richard Vandermeer. I've been thinking, that $10 million fund isn't enough. I want to establish a foundation, a real organization dedicated to exotic animal welfare and advocacy. And I want to fund it properly. $50 million to start. Are you interested in helping me set it up? Dr. Wilhelm's surprise was evident even over the phone. That's incredibly generous, Mr. Vandermeer. It's not generous, Richard corrected. It's the least I can do. Apollo deserves a legacy beyond just the story of how I failed him. And there are thousands of animals out there, in situations like his, suffering because humans think they can own wildness. I want to help them. All of them. The foundation was established 3 months later. The Apollo Sanctuary Project, named after the lion whose death had catalyzed its creation. It funded rescues, supported sanctuaries, lobbied for stronger laws, and educated the public about the realities of exotic pet ownership. Richard threw himself into the work. It became his life, in a way his tech empire never truly had, because this work had meaning beyond profit margins and market share. Every animal rescued meant Apollo's suffering hadn't been entirely meaningless. Every law passed meant Christopher's trauma had resulted in protection for other children. It would never be enough. Richard understood that. He could spend every dollar he had, dedicate every remaining day of his life to this cause, and it still wouldn't undo what he had done. But it was something, and something was better than the nothing he had offered when Apollo was alive and needed him to be better. 5 years after the attack, on a warm spring afternoon remarkably similar to that terrible day, Richard received a letter. It was handwritten, the script careful and deliberate, the kind of writing that comes from someone still learning to form letters properly. The return address was Connecticut. The sender was Christopher. Dear Dad, Mom helped me write this because I wanted to make sure I said it right. I'm 9 years old now. I still remember what happened with Apollo, but it doesn't scare me as much anymore. My therapist says that's because I'm processing the trauma in healthy ways. I don't really know what that means, but Mom says it's good. I wanted to tell you that I've been learning about lions in school. Real lions in Africa. Did you know that they live in groups called prides? And the females do most of the hunting? And they can run really fast, but only for a little bit? My teacher showed us videos, and I was scared at first, but then I realized something. Apollo wasn't bad. He was just a lion who couldn't be himself. And you weren't bad either, even though what you did was wrong. Mom explained that people can make really big mistakes without being bad people. She said you're trying to fix your mistake by helping other animals, and that's important. I saw a video of you talking to Congress about lions and other exotic animals. You cried when you talked about me. I cried too when I watched it. But they were okay tears, not scared tears. I think Apollo would be happy that you're helping other animals like him. Or maybe lions don't think about stuff like that. I don't know. but I like to think he would be happy. Can I visit you sometime? Without Mom supervising? I think I'm ready. Love, Christopher. Richard read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face. His hands shook as he held the paper. This precious gift from the son he thought might never fully trust him again. The weight he had carried for 5 years, the guilt, the shame, the certainty that he had permanently destroyed his relationship with his child, didn't disappear. But it lightened just a bit. He called Victoria that evening. "Thank you," he said when she answered, "for helping him write that letter, for raising him to be the kind of person who can forgive." "I'm not the one you should thank," Victoria replied. Her voice had softened over the years, the sharp edges of anger worn down by time and Christopher's healing. "That's all Christopher. He's an extraordinary kid, Richard, despite everything, or maybe because of it." "Can he really visit? Alone?" Richard asked, hardly daring to hope. "I think so," Victoria said. "He's been asking for months. His therapist thinks it would be good for him, a sign of how far he's come. But Richard, no pressure. Let him lead. Let him talk about Apollo if he wants, or not talk about him. Just be his dad. Not the guy trying to make up for what happened. Just his dad." The visit happened 2 weeks later. Christopher arrived on a Saturday morning, carrying a backpack and wearing a brave expression that reminded Richard of Elena facing down Apollo in that courtyard 5 years earlier. The boy had grown. He was tall for 9, with Richard's build and Victoria's eyes. They spent the day together. Richard had worried about bringing Christopher to the mansion, afraid the memories would be too much, but Christopher had insisted. "I need to see it," he explained, "to prove to myself I'm not scared anymore." They walked through the house, and eventually, inevitably, made their way to the courtyard. The oak tree was still there. Apollo's enclosure had been torn down years ago, replaced with a garden that Victoria had designed, a memorial of sorts, though they never explicitly called it that. "This is where it happened," Christopher said quietly, standing at the spot where Apollo had pinned him. "I remember the tile feeling cold, and how big Apollo seemed, like he took up the whole sky." "Do you want to leave?" Richard asked, ready to take his son anywhere he wanted to go. "No," Christopher said. He sat down, right there on the spot, and looked up at his father. "Tell me about Apollo. Not about the attack. Tell me about when he was a cub. Tell me about the good parts." So Richard did. He told Christopher about Apollo's first days in the mansion, about how playful he had been, about the time he tried to chase a butterfly and ended up tumbling over his own paws. He told him about Apollo's favorite food, chicken, oddly enough, which he would crunch with obvious delight. He told him about the way Apollo would lie in the sun for hours, looking like a golden statue. And Christopher listened and smiled and asked questions, and gradually, Richard realized what his son was doing. He was reclaiming the narrative. He was turning Apollo from a symbol of trauma into a complete being, flawed, tragic, but real. Before Christopher left that evening, he asked one more question. "Dad, do you think you're a good person now?" Richard considered this carefully. "I think I'm trying to be. I think I made a terrible mistake, and I've spent 5 years trying to do something meaningful with that mistake. But I don't know if that makes me good. That's not really for me to decide." Christopher nodded, looking older than 9. "I think you're good," he said. "Not perfect, but good. Because good people make mistakes too. They just have to try to fix them." Out of the mouths of babes. You've reached the end of the story, and by doing so, you've proven yourself to be someone who doesn't shy away from uncomfortable truths. This isn't a story with a happy ending, not really. Christopher will always carry scars, visible and invisible. Apollo is dead and cannot be brought back. The family that existed before that terrible afternoon is gone forever. But it's a story with meaning. It's a story that reveals the profound cost of arrogance, of believing that wealth can override nature, of treating wild creatures as possessions rather than beings with their own needs and instincts. It's a story about responsibility, about the moment when we must face what we've done and choose whether to hide from it or to transform it into something that might prevent future suffering. If this story moved you, if it changed how you think about exotic animals kept as pets, if it made you understand the cost of human arrogance, I asked you to comment with this phrase: "This story changed the way I see the human mind." When you do, you're not just engaging with content. You're joining a community of people who seek truth, who aren't afraid to confront uncomfortable realities, who understand that the most important stories are often the most difficult to hear. Share this video, not for the algorithm, not for the views, but because somewhere out there, someone might be considering buying an exotic animal. Someone might be convincing themselves that they're different, that the rules don't apply to them, that they can control wildness. And this story might be the thing that stops them. It might save a child. It might save an animal. It might prevent a tragedy. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories that challenge, that provoke, that force you to question assumptions and confront truths that society often prefers to keep hidden. We live in a world that loves simple answers and comfortable lies. Here, we trade in complexity and honesty. There are more stories waiting for you. Stories about the moments when human nature collides with the wild world. Stories about the choices we make and the consequences we cannot escape. Stories about redemption and failure and the thin line between the two. The relationship between humans and wild animals is not what most people think. It's not a Disney movie where love conquers all. It's not a simple matter of treat them well and they'll be safe. It's complex, dangerous, and filled with tragic potential. Understanding that complexity, respecting that danger, accepting those limitations, that's how we prevent stories like Christopher and Apollo's from repeating. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being willing to face a truth that's difficult and disturbing but desperately important. The next video is waiting. Your journey into the inexplicable continues. Click it, watch it, learn from it, because knowledge is the only real protection we have against repeating the mistakes of those who came before us.